But Ellison's own understanding through his own family and through the community that he grew up in, which was segregated Oklahoma, taught him that at least the Blacks that he knew were not simply victims, that they were negotiating, navigating, and pressing back in direct ways and indirect ways to the discrimination that they faced.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at BRI, and we're very honored this time to have scholar Lucas Morel, who is going to discuss Ralph Ellison. Now, the guiding question for this series is, what contribution did this person make to understanding the Black experience in America? And by way of introduction, Lucas Morel, who needs no introduction at BRI because he's a great friend of ours, but he's a professor of politics at Washington and Lee University, and the author and editor of several books. And we discussed his most recent book, Lincoln and the American Founding, on a recent Scholar Talk, so you should check that out. And he's also the editor of two fine books on Ralph Ellison, including Ralph Ellison and the Raft of Hope, a political companion to Invisible Man, and also The New Territory, Ralph Ellison and the 21st Century. Lucas, thank you for joining us again.
Great to be here, Tony.
Great. Well, as we jump right in, you write that Ellison did not set out to write what's called a protest novel, but rather to explore more broadly the human condition and the African-American experience. And so what was Ellison's view of the role of fiction and of the novelist in a free society, especially one that is not achieving its ideals equally for all?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's one that he addressed directly in his acceptance speech when his novel, surprisingly, especially to him, it's his first book. It won the National Book Award. It's the first book award to be won, National Book Award to be won by a Black author. The book Invisible Man was published in 1952, and the award came in the following year. Saul Bellow, who became a good friend of Ellison's after, was on that committee that awarded the novel that prize. And so the speech that Ellison gave is titled "Startling Words for Brave Words for a Startling Occasion," or something to that effect. And it's not a long speech, but it's a very profound and deep one and sophisticated one in terms of Ellison explaining the craft of a novelist and what Ellison was attempting to do in his novel as a Black American. But you got to underline not just Black, you have to underline American. Ellison was very struck with how Western Blacks who grew up in America were. If others have said that racism is in America's DNA, I think Ellison would say actually the Western experience and tradition and civilization actually goes deeper than race. You don't have to read very far into the novel to know that Ellison thinks race is a big deal in America, but in a way, America was a bigger deal. And it was a bigger deal in part because of what Blacks did to contribute to the development of the United States, not just economically, but culturally and politically throughout our history. And so the brave words that he gave for that startling occasion of winning the award were that he thought that something had gone missing from the American novel since essentially the turn of the century. He really saw folks like Mark Twain wrestling in a serious way with the race question in the United States because it was such a pivotal question, a pivotal problem. And great as other authors who came later were, like Hemingway, who influenced Ellison's writing style, at the end of the day, Ellison had problems with Hemingway because Hemingway fell short of speaking about America because he didn't deal with the role that race had to play in our development. And so he was trying to contribute, as it were, his literary widow's mite, right? The two mites, as an unknown author, and trying to put the Black contribution to America into fiction. I should hasten to add here that his best friend, by the time that he got around to writing this novel, was a man named Richard Wright. And Richard Wright, of course, wrote one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, entitled Native Son. But in Native Son, the Black protagonist is a fairly two-dimensional character who is all about simply reacting to the world around him. It is all cause and response, or stimulus and response. And Ellison thought that that fell very far short of what Blacks had by necessity, by an environment of racism and discrimination. It fell very far short of telling the Black American story in terms of how Blacks had to improvise, use humor, and develop so many virtues and attributes to survive in the crucible that was American race, and also to make meaning out of life, and things like jazz and the blues and folklore. Ellison thought, wow, Blacks were making contributions even while they were still enslaved. How could this be missed? And so he thought, in a way, although he never put it this way, in a way, Invisible Man is a response to his best friend's incredible novel, Native Son, in showing someone who is not simply a victim of the racial structuring of the society around him, but how this person came to learn how to make a way out of no way, as they used to say. And one thing to remember as well is that the vast majority of the characters in this novel are Black, and they don't all think, let alone act the same way. And the protagonist, who is also a young Black man, he's having to negotiate his way and figure out his way as he encounters all these people who he learns painfully and unfortunately, after very many trials, he learns don't have his best interests at heart. And so it's not simply a race novel, I guess is one thing I should say, but it is a novel that Ellison tried to make a contribution to telling America and the world the truth, not simply about the Black man's condition, but the truth about the human condition.
Right, and very good. And so you mentioned the idea of contribution, and that was my next question, actually. In your essay in Raft of Hope, you speak a lot about the incredibly important role of the Black individual in Ellison's Invisible Man, and how Black individuals can both challenge racial discrimination, but also contribute to American culture broadly. You mentioned jazz and novels and in other ways. So. So what is that role of the individual?
Yeah, Ellison did not believe that you could have produced something so significant and lasting. You couldn't make a contribution that eventually became a part of a nation's culture, like its music, like its folklore, the stories we tell about ourselves that reflect our understanding of a man's place in the world. That you couldn't do that if you were simply the victim of discrimination. In fact, later in life, Ellison wrote an essay called On Being the Target of Discrimination. And he described a trip to the local zoo. He grew up in Oklahoma. His father died when he was about 3 years old. So he grew up basically in a single parent home. But his mother was a very forceful character, very strong woman. And even though she knew the local zoo was whites only, she took her kids, her two boys, to the zoo and intended to stay in that zoo until they got kicked out, which they eventually did. So that's one of the stories he tells in this essay, but the title is very telling. It's not on being the victim of discrimination. It's on being the target of discrimination. Nobody can doubt or debate the fact that this country victimized folks on the basis of race, among other things. But Ellison's own understanding through his own family and through the community that he grew up in, which was segregated Oklahoma, taught him that at least the Blacks that he knew were not simply victims, that they were negotiating, navigating, and pressing back in direct ways and indirect ways to the discrimination that they faced. And Ellison learned from authors, not all of whom were Black, but one author in particular, Frederick Douglass. He learned that what was crucial for progress in this country was for Blacks to fight for their freedom and act as free men and women, even before the laws were changed, even before customs changed. And he tried to show examples of that in the novel. As he put it, I wanted to get these characters, I wanted to get this reality of Black American life into fiction before these characters disappeared, before people become incredulous in terms of thinking about, well, wait, that actually happened? Blacks were fighting for their freedom even before Lincoln, even before 13th Amendment, even before Martin Luther King came around. Ellison was trying to get that into his fiction, which included short stories as well. Without the heroism of both well-known as well as not well-known people, from Martin Luther King to his own mother, Ida Ellison, he was trying to make them part of the fictional dramatis personae of this country.
Okay, great. And so we just talked about contribution, but also you write a lot about Ellison and individual responsibility. So how does the novel Invisible Man draw this out?
Well, it draws it out at length. In other words, it's not something we see in Invisible Man, the narrator very overtly, let's say it happens over time in his own life. He realizes he doesn't simply have to do what his environment tells him to do. He learns over time, wait a second, I've got a role to play. I have agency, as we like to say. I can take initiative. But it takes him a while to figure this out. But even early in the novel, perhaps the most famous scene, it comes in chapter 1, we see Invisible Man already taking at least a modicum of responsibility. He is a star student from the local high school, and he is asked to come to what's known as a smoker, a party where all the bigwigs in town, which are all white, from all walks of life, from politics, commerce, to church, they're all there. All the white movers and shakers are there. And he thinks he's being asked to give his high school valedictory speech, which he has memorized. It turns out he will eventually give that speech, but they make him take part in what is known as the battle royale, basically last man standing. 10 young Black youth are just, trunks, boxer trunks and gloves are thrown in the ring at the same time, and they're blindfolded. So the last man standing gets what they thought would be a prize, and he's one of the last two standing. Well, how does he become one of the last two standing? He's not the fastest, or certainly not the strongest or most vicious. He wants to be an orator. He wants to use words to make a living, not his fists. But we find there's one scene that Ellison writes very tellingly. He says, as they were blindfolding these kids with white blindfolds, of course, Ellison says two things. He says, and when he allowed him to put the blindfold on, in other words, there was a choice that Invisible Man could make. He could have said, no, I don't want to participate in this smoker. This is demeaning. Now, that would have had consequences, but it was a choice. And Ellison phrases it, he allowed him. What does Invisible Man do? He scrunches his face. He, at the moment, figures out, wait, if I do something facially, when they're done tying the blindfold, I relax and it'll allow me to see at least. There'll be a gap in it. And so we see, even in a situation where it looks like it's all environment, it's all circumstances, it's all external, there's no room for initiative or will at all. Even in that moment, Ellison illustrates that that's not so much the case. I think perhaps the greatest example comes actually in the prologue, even before the novel begins formally, if you will, which presents itself as a memoir. Ellison has the name of the utility company called Monopolated Light and Power. Now, think about that. Monopolated Light and Power. From the very outset of the novel, Ellison says, hey, what if there were this institution that had all the power, almost godlike, right? Light, let there be light. So this utility company, it calls itself Monopolated. But what is Invisible Man actually doing in his apartment? He is stealing electricity The power company knows two things. Somebody is using a whole lot of electricity somewhere near Harlem. It's not smack dab. It's kind of in this liminal place in terms of location, but we don't know how. We don't know where. Where is it going? They can't do it. And so Ellison from the jump is already indicating, yes, my novelist, who you will find, he doesn't tell you explicitly, but you learn in the prologue, he is a Black man living in predominantly white America, but he has wired his apartment. He tells the reader he's wired the apartment with 1,369 light bulbs, and he is firing them all up. He is trying to get back, if you will, the power and the electricity that they gouged or extorted from him when he was willingly paying for it. Now he's like, no, you owe me. And so there are a lot of those sorts of details along the way that Ellison includes to indicate to the reader, look, not all, it's not all like you think it is. This company calls itself monopolated, but does it really have total control over this particular person's life? Apparently not.
Right. And Lucas, I read a lot of your books and essays, and you've reflected over a lifetime of scholarship on the Declaration of Independence, and that really does actually, the equality principle plays a key role in Invisible Man, particularly with the narrator's grandfather, and then later on in the epilogue. So how does Ellison grapple with this central question of the American regime, and grappling with this contradiction and making sure it's fulfilled for all people?
Yeah, I would say that it's one of the central issues that is grappled with in the novel, and it's no surprise that it comes front and center at the end of the story, what you refer to as the epilogue, and he titles it the epilogue. It's we're being brought back to the present after the narrator has told us his story. But the epilogue doesn't simply repeat what he said in the prologue at the beginning. And what's interesting is what you call the principle of equality. The grandfather and the narrator recounting what the grandfather taught him about that, they never use the word equality. They never say, oh, it's from the Declaration of Independence. He uses this one phrase, the principle. It must be the principle. It must be the principle. And you think, well, good grief, it's clearly equality. Why doesn't he say it? Well, I think Ellison is trying to get the reader to wrestle with that very notion. Well, of course, this means equality. Well, what have you learned about equality in this novel? We learned that it isn't a practical reality for all members of American society, and race. It's not the only thing. It could be sex as well. Women, right? It's 1950s after all. But equality, especially in terms of the role that race unfortunately has played in this country, equality is something we say, but we don't always do. And so I think the principle has to be measured along with a very explicit wrestling with the notion of responsibility. In the prologue, in fact, closes with a discussion of how an invisible man, and generally speaking, the protagonist as a young Black man representing all Black people, how can an invisible man be responsible? If you don't acknowledge my existence, and if you don't see the reciprocal relationship we should have as fellow citizens, what do I owe you? Why must I obey your laws if they're not laws that I help contribute to? They're not laws that truly protect me equally, as the 14th Amendment is supposedly guaranteeing me. Remember, this is a novel that was published before Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. It's published 12 years before the landmark legislation of Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. And already Ellison is putting on the table for the country, how is it that we can narrow the gap? How is it that we can align what we do more closely with what we profess to believe in? In a subsequent novel that was published posthumously in 1999 called Juneteenth, and then later, 3 days before the shooting, for a more full example. In Juneteenth, Ellison has a scene where he says, one of the protagonists says, he's got them caught between what they profess to believe and what they feel they cannot do without. That is the story, the long civil rights struggle that is American history. It's this long civil rights struggle, as I think of it. Our challenge to, as King put it, be true to what we said on paper. Ellison gets the reader to think about responsibility, personal responsibility, social responsibility throughout the novel, and it pivots. The fulcrum of it is this question: do we truly believe that all human beings, all men, are really created equal and therefore have rights simply by virtue of the fact that they're human beings, and that it cannot be freedom for me and not for thee?
Right. Last question. I know we can have a whole course on this, or maybe write a whole book on it. But what is what is Ralph Ellison's contribution to understanding the Black experience in America?
Whew, okay. A pat answer to that.
2 minutes.
Well, I mean, a great essay that addresses this is one that was published in Time magazine in 1970. And the title of the essay is "What America Would Be Like Without Blacks." And in that essay, Ellison recounts in prose what he conveyed in fiction in Invisible Man. And what he recounts there is his understanding of the contributions that Black people have made. In short, that a history, an honest, capacious, comprehensive history of the development of this country, at least since 1776, when we were born, according to Lincoln, and I'm with Lincoln on this, and not some other people who think it was earlier. That history, if it is to be honest and comprehensive, must depict, even through slavery times, must depict Blacks as men and women who were struggling along with white allies, as we like to say today, struggling for their freedom. It wasn't that we had to wait till Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation or Martin Luther King in I Have a Dream speech or the letter from Birmingham jail, but that it's been entirely throughout this country that Blacks have participated both directly in the development of freedom, starting with the American Revolution, and in every war Blacks have fought, but they have also been fighting politically and socially and economically to not only make contributions to this country, but contributions to their local community and contributions to their own freedom. Frederick Douglass, I mentioned Frederick Douglass earlier, and I didn't finish that point. Frederick Douglass said that until you became free within yourself, you would never be able to benefit from your freedom once the laws changed. And that was something he discovered when he was a slave. And he talks about this in his autobiographies, yeah, plural. He says that while he might have been a slave in form, in other words, in terms of society around him and the laws, he had become a free man in fact. In other words, when he recognized that it had to start with him, he could not wait for his environment to change in order to exercise his freedom as a human being. And of course, that is a monumental task. If you are enslaved, if all the elements around you seem to not be in your favor, but Douglass was very clear on that message. And that was a message, of course, that wasn't going to be heard from by slaves for the most part. It was going to be heard by segregated Black people who he was trying to teach, look, you can't wait for the laws to change. You have got to work on that. You have got to act like a free person. You have to gain that respect. You've got to make sure that the stereotypes and prejudices and the bigotry around you have no ground to stand on. And Ellison, I think, drew from Douglass, among other people, that lesson, that freedom was the possession of Black people from the jump. They were denied. It was obstructed in so many ways, but they were fighting the whole time. And his novel and his essays and his interviews all bring to the foreground of the American consciousness that part of our past, that reality. And it was something that he believed was true, not because they were Black, but because they were human beings.
Lucas, on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us. And I think
Sure.
it'd be really inspired if our teachers, our students, our citizens who are watching have not yet read Invisible Man or Juneteenth or your remarkable essays on Ellison. I think you've inspired them to do so. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our other installments on Black intellectuals and the African American experience, including Frederick Douglass and Anna Julia Cooper. And check out our upcoming series on pivotal battles in American history, and yet another series on the Cold War and the presidency. So lots of food for thought. Thank you very much for joining us.